Tonight, we won't begin with crowns or battles, nor with the noisy business of kings and conquerors. Instead, we step into a quieter story, one that starts with a single sheet of gazelle skin stretched smooth over a table in Istanbul, where the ink itself seems to lean forward, as if it knows a secret. Outside, the Bosphorus turns silver under a pale morning, but inside, a man bends over maps the way a jeweler leans over gems. His name is Piri Reis, captain, cartographer, collector of coastlines whispered across centuries. In the margins of his work, he writes not poetry, but precision. Notes comparing 20 older maps, Arabic and Portuguese, some drawn by sailors who never met each other yet somehow agreed on the shape of the same distant shore. Among these fragments is a rumor, a chart from Columbus himself, rescued from the shuffle of conquest and storms. And here, in the early 1500s, all of it begins to gather on this single skin of parchment, as if the world wants, for once, to be seen whole. So lower the lights. Let the water outside the window grow still, because before the mysteries come, the impossible coastlines, the lands drawn too well, the questions too big for the century that asked them, this is where the ink takes its first careful breath. Or maybe it already burns, deep in some forgotten map room, or under the rafters of a hall where the wind carries secrets instead of smoke. The kind of fire that lights faces but never quite reaches the walls, where every flicker feels like it's rehearsing for a story older than its own flames. Follow its warmth carefully, because beyond the circle of light, the night always keeps a second voice, ready to tell you what the day chose not to. A scrap of gazelle skin, trimmed to a tidy rectangle, carries coastlines like a memory that refuses to fade. Morning settles over the Bosphorus in pale metal light. Seabirds argue in the distance, and the water keeps its silence. In a small room near the arsenal, or perhaps aboard a ship that sways with the tide, Piri Ibn Haji, Mehmed leans over a table scattered with sources, Arabic portalains ringed with wind roses, Portuguese letters copied by scribes who never left the shore fragments rumored to come from Columbus himself. He writes in the margins with the precision of a man balancing ledgers rather than dreaming of empires. 20 maps compared, coastlines checked, lines drawn until agreement feels inevitable. No grand speeches, no flourish, only the steady rhythm of ink and the quiet weight of maps that should not yet exist. It is not romance. It is paperwork with waves. The parchment, he chooses carefully. Gazelle skin is thin and strong, a luxury for scribes who fear both time and elbows. He draws with a light touch, coasts that look like sentences, islands that look like commas, wind lines that feel like sighs. He adds little ships, almost as a joke to himself, the way bored students doodle in margins. He writes, quite soberly, that he has assembled a world from fragments. He is ecologist of oceans. He is also an uncle. His famous corsair relative, Piri Reis, has taught him that the sea remembers everything and forgives nothing. We know almost none of this for certain, which is part of the charm. What we do have is a single surviving piece, resting behind glass in Topkapi Palace, the western half of a larger chart that vanished the way maps sometimes do into fires or floods, or cupboards that develop an appetite. The fragment places the Atlantic in your lap like a cat that will not be moved. West Africa climbs up the left side in careful scallops. Iberia sits like a neat stamp. The New World leans in, new and shy and already annotated. Much of the original is gone. It is not a dramatic kind of gone, not a pirate torch or a storm. It is the quiet attrition of centuries, the way edges fray and corners curl, the way a note breaks off in mid-sentence, as if the writer sneezed and never came back. The missing half becomes a kind of soft soundtrack. You read the fragment and feel the ache of what it used to be, like listening to one ear of a melody and sensing the other line just out of reach. The torn border looks like a shoreline itself, a coast of absent paper with bays and capes shaped by time's teeth. Curators measure the pigments and date the hand. Tourists press closer and then step back, not sure what they re-allowed to feel about an ink line that once told sailors where to go. Turn the fragment slowly and notice the southern edge. There, in the room where researchers lower lamps and breathe as quietly as librarians, a smooth coastline runs like a ribbon along the map's bottom margin. It is long, confident, and strangely cold-looking for a line so warm in color. Enthusiasts stare at it and sense Antarctica, not the icy cap we know from television, but a lower world drawn as if glacier-free. As if a prow once skimmed along the shore, now buried under miles of quiet blue-white weight. Skeptics purse their lips and rotate the map, and remind everyone that early modern cartographers were very good at several things, including guessing. Terra Australis has a way of appearing where boredom does. Stretched Patagonias are also possible, especially when you assemble a world from rumors. The polite debate takes place in murmurs. Shorelines are compared to seismic data with the seriousness of people who have learned the cost of certainty. Your eyes wander upwards away from the argument to features that feel too early. A correct river mouth here, a cluster of islands there. Annotations about cinnamon winds and red-skinned people that sound like echoes of somebody else's voyage, written in someone else's handwriting. Piri's notes mention 20 sources. He hints that some were taken off captured Portuguese pilots, which is a very practical way to do library research at sea. And Norwegian sailors wander through the footnotes like ghosts who still smell of tar and oranges. You begin to understand why this fragile thing invites deep breathing and careful adjectives. It is not miraculous. It is too stubborn for miracles. It may simply be that the Atlantic kept better records than we think, and that those records passed hand to hand in cramped cabins where oil lamps leaned with the swell. Meanwhile, the marginalia stay calm. This coast is drawn from Columbus, one note implies, with the dry humor of a man who refuses to embroider when a straight stitch will do. Piri does not shout, he makes little arrows. He treats the ocean like a filing cabinet. Still, as you follow the southern line that may or may not be what some want it to be, a hush arrives and settles. Bedtime enjoys a question that does not demand an answer. An old habit of sailors is to invent older sailors. If you put enough men in a tavern long enough, someone will mention Alexandria and its lost shelves, or Phoenicians slipping around capes in ships that were braver than their owners. The Piri Reis fragment has a way of attracting such talk, perhaps because it looks like a puzzle where your favorite piece could fit if you press politely. One theory says that some deep archive Greek or Roman or nameless survived in the Islamic Golden Age, quietly copied, quietly consulted, quietly loaned to a careful Ottoman who traced a coastline with a smile nobody noticed. Another theory prefers medieval Mediterranean rumor, moonlit pilot books moving from chest to chest, charts measured not with chains and theodolites, but with sandglasses and the attestations of men who gestured, with their whole arm when indicating a harbor. The atmosphere these stories build is pleasant and dry. A lamp hangs in a captain's cabin. The ship creaks like a tired library cart. Outside, the sea keeps not quite steady advice. Within that hollow sound, you can imagine information passing hand to hand, as if knowledge were a loaf of bread that must be carried before it goes stale. Then come the other whispers, the European ones with coats on. 16th-century courts kept maps like secrets. Portugal's royal archives hugged their coastal lists the way bankers hug ledgers. Spain built offices where information about the Indies was a controlled substance. In such rooms, a map that said too much too soon could be inconvenient. A chart like Piri's might embarrass or destabilize, or simply complicate a story someone preferred to tell about who arrived first and who drew second. You can almost see a clerk deciding that the best place for a parchment is a quiet one behind other parchments. Missing folios are a genre. Margins are excellent at swallowing remarks that should have been remembered. Whatever the truth, The fragment makes space for these shadows without actually needing them. Like many good bedtime objects, it entertains both possibility and boredom with equal grace. If you have drifted even a little, that is appropriate. Conspiracies make drowsy companions when they agree to sit by the window and keep their voices down. Back in the bright laboratory, the romance is weighed, measured, and gently set on a table that does not wobble. Modern science loves maps the way cats love sun patches, with devotion and a preference for specific rectangles. Conservators bring out microscopes like librarians bringing extra chairs. Under raking light, pigments become themselves in a way the naked eye cannot manage. Reds reveal their little mineral biographies. Blacks show binder-like polish on worn shoes. The inks concede their iron. The parchment speaks through pores. Animal, prepared, stretched, scraped. Human, handled, folded, taken on a journey or two before being kept still for a very long time. Multispectral imaging peers into inks that look uniform and discovers notes that faded the way steep tea fades when you forget the cup on a windowsill. Little corrections appear, a coastline nudged, a name respelled, a ship added because the corner was empty and the cartographer had a sense of humor. Compass roses point with the determination of people who do not yet have magnetic declination in their vocabulary, which is one of the reasons that some lines sit slightly ajar next to modern charts like picture frames hung by a person who stood a bit left of center. Yet other sections align so well that a sigh escapes the room. Accuracy arrives in pockets like warmth in an old coat. The verdict from the microscopes and the historians is both solid and humane. The parts that are good are very good. The parts that are wishful are charmingly human. The whole is early 16th century work executed with care by a professional who trusted his sources and admitted his seams. The fragment, in other words, is what it says it is. Not a miracle, not a prank, not proof of an ancient satellite office in Carthage, just a skillful patchwork by a sailor who had seen too much water to pretend he had seen it all. This is a restful conclusion. It leaves you free to enjoy the aesthetics. The little caravel with taut lines like a cat, stretching the ornamental wind-blowing faces like polite weather, clerks the way the Atlantic is not so much blue as a soft field for other colors to rest upon. In the quiet, you notice your own breathing. You imagine Piri doing the same, tapping the page, knowing it is finished enough. Still, the bedtime question returns, less to be answered than to keep you company. What if the southern ribbon is a memory of a shore now locked under ice? What if an anonymous pilot carried a scrap in his mind, the way you carry a melody you cannot place? What if Piri has lost half, which would have continued eastward into another set of coasts and rumors, held a note we would recognize? The human mind enjoys these what-ifs the way a child enjoys pulling a blanket to the chin. They are cozy, which is the same as plausible, which is a close cousin to true when you are nearly asleep. But another what-if might be kinder. What if the real marvel is not Antarctica's possible cameo, or the notion of Phoenicians rehearsing for the age of discovery 2 millennia early, but the simple, patient labor visible everywhere on the skin of the map? What if the miracle is care? A cartographer compared margins and made choices. He eliminated contradictions the way a careful cook skims foam from stock. He wrote that he had done so. He signed it with a name that would be footnoted for 500 years by people who would go on to argue about ice shelves and island chains. That calm professionalism is its own lullaby. We live in a loud time, but the fragment hums in a key that belongs to desks, to steady lamps, to the slow, precise movement of a hand that knows when to lift. In the palace today, you stand behind the line on the floor and lean in, just a little. The parchment does not mind you. It has survived humidity in hands and a century-long nap in a drawer. It can survive your curiosity. The guard nods. You consider the torn edge again, the ragged place where the larger world used to continue. Each notch is like a harbor from which nothing will ever sail again. Yet, oddly, the absence does not feel tragic tonight. It feels appropriate to a world that was always partly rumor. The oceans on any map are not water. They are space for movement, and movement is what made these coastlines common property. A pilot from one kingdom teaches a helmsman from another how a river smells before dawn. A scribe copies the place name wrong, but the shape right. A windrose borrows its petals from a rose that grew far away. Piri gathered, and the fragment gathers us. It asks nothing more ambitious than attention. If you listen closely, you hear his marginal voice, professional to the end. I used every chart I could find, and where they disagreed, I let the coast speak for itself. It is a lovely epic for bedtime. In the final scene, because all last scenes happen at the edge of light, imagine a table where the admiral sits a little sideways so the parchment can breathe. He taps a corner. He adds a tiny ship because empty corners make him uneasy. He writes one more note in a hand that means business. This bay is known to Portuguese pilots. This island is told by sailors of Andalus. He lifts the pen. The ink dries with a small, private shine. Somewhere a door closes softly. The map will travel, and then not travel, and then be found. Other coastlines are still missing. He might have said, and who first drew them? He might have wondered, not with suspicion, but with the craftsman's modest curiosity about colleagues he will never meet. The room grows quieter. The fragment keeps its own slow time. The sea outside the palace is dark but friendly. You can follow a thin, careful line with your eyes until you cannot, and then you let the line continue without you, the way shorelines do, until the map, the room, and the chatter of old debates drift like small ships into a harbor, where every question is simply another way to trace the edge, and every answer is a margin note that ends mid-sentence because the lamp went out and no one thought to light it again. You might not expect a spray of thin lines that all meet at a little star to hold anyone. As attention past the first yawn, but the windrose on an old sea chart is surprisingly chatty when the room is quiet. Imagine a desk that smells faintly of salt and warmed glue. Parchment, pale and slightly translucent, lies tacked at the corner so it won't curl while the air shifts. A cartographer anonymous enough to be restful dips a quill in iron gall ink that has the color of a well-steeped afternoon. He does not begin with coasts or mountains. He finds the center and draws a circle with a divider. Then he pricks points on the rim and, with the patience of someone tying 32 small knots in a rope, pulls straight lines through the middle. These are not meridians or latitudes. They're rums, the tidy skeleton of imagined sailing directions, a geometry of habit more than of earth. They carry old wind names that still sound like weather talking to itself. Tramontana from the north, Austro from the south, Greco from the northeast, Libeccio from the southwest. The names enter the page like shy guests and take their places in colored ink red and green, sometimes blue so that a pilot glancing down can tell at once where the ship ought to lean. The rose is a compass that doesn't need to move. It is also a modest work of ornament, little fleur-de-lis for the north point, a star that looks more embroidered than drawn. If you manage to stay awake a few minutes longer, and your blanket hasn't declared a mutiny and seized the watch, feel free to subscribe for more small, persistent lines. Or don't. I'll mark the course either way, a soft bell every now and then to keep the hour. The rose's lines are not instructions. They read a conversation about probabilities held between sailors who trusted experience more than mathematics because experience could be tied to a cleat and mathematics could not. A ship under square sails would fall off a wind by a familiar angle, and the angle pressed itself into these lines the way a body leaves a dent in a feather pillow. A pilot tracing along one rum toward Majorca would imagine the wind steady and the sea moderate, and the sky busy with nothing in particular. Then at the next change of watch, he demarked the new position on the chart in a private shorthand of dots, and Little crosses fold the parchment and tuck it into the chest where cloves, pipe stems, and spare cordage smelled companionable together. The accuracy of the whole enterprise was lightweight and social. If a cape was misdrawn by a finger's breadth, a sailor might correct it later with a note in the margin, or he might choose simply to sail wider and tell the next man over a mug. "Beware the rock that is not on the map," says one early pilot book in a tone that suggests the author learned slowly and at cost. I like to think of a sleepy scribe writing that out, pausing after the word rock, and deciding not to be more specific because the specificity would be wrong again in a year. Charts at sea were living documents in the mild way that sourdough starters are. They soured and revived, picked up local character, and sometimes, when neglected, surprised everyone. If you step closer to any old portal windows, Mediterranean charts that look like spiderwebs sunbathing, you find more wind roses than you need. Not one, but several, sprinkled so a navigator needn't turn the parchment round and round on a cramped table. Each rose is like a little town of lines, and the towns neighbor each other the way small ports do along a familiar coast. On some sheets, the lines grow so dense that the sea seems to wear linen. To a modern eye, this looks like a lack of restraint. To a tired sailor, it looked like relief, because any direction you wished to imagine was already there, ready to be traveled with the tip of a divider. The coasts on these charts were drawn with a love of practical detail and a suspicion of grand theory. Capes jut ferociously, bays curl like a cupped ear. Harbors are marked with small circles that feel like buttons you could fasten. Inland, almost nothing. A cathedral or a king might be sketched there, but mostly the land refuses to exist unless a ship could scratch it with a keel. The sea is the extrovert. The earth shy, this bias makes the maps feel honest in a drowsy way. They admit they're not about everything. Now and then the cartographer indulges himself. He draws a tiny castle on a headland that probably only boasted goats, or he inks a sea monster that looks as bored as a cat. There is a gentle joke at the fringes of many roses. The North Point fleur-de-lis sometimes grows large enough to be gaudy, as if it were secretly in charge of the whole chart and had insisted on a taller hat. The names of the winds linger on the tongue like the taste of salt, even after the cup is empty. Tramontana means beyond the mountains, a north that hides behind a barrier of stone. Sirocco comes from the Arabic for east and is warm, dusty, and polite only in winter. Mistral arrives as if late for an appointment and behaves briskly about your hair. On the page, these become abbreviated whispers: Tramo, Ciro, Mr., tucked near the tips of the star. You can study a rose and hear an old deck officer mutter instructions. Steer Greco-Levante, then fall to Levante by a point, then keep a weather eye on Mabeccio after sunset. The arithmetic of all this was human scale, points and half points, the counting of hours by glass, the number of meals taken since a known landmark. No ship ever stayed on a rum for long. It fell off and corrected, but the insistence of the lines gave the mind a place to rest between course changes. In that sense, a windrose is the cartography of compromise. You bring an intention to it, and it gives you an angle you can live with. It is quietly pleased to be useful, like a time-worn tool that you pick up without looking. When I read the oldest pilot manuals, I find mild absurdities that feel affectionate rather than foolish. Instructions to find an island by sailing until the water looks greenish enough, or to know a shoal when the sea remembers to change its voice. These are not mistakes. They are instruments with no dials that ask you to notice more than you plan to. A scene change arrives as gently as a roll of the hull. The desk grows smaller. The workshop expands into a harbor where charts and wind gossips circulate like bread. In Venetian warehouses, on Mallorcan wharfs, in Genoese pilot rooms that never quite clean their lamps. The making of roses becomes a craft with a market. Parchment sellers nod to men who will only buy skins that have stretched without bubbles. Ink makers argue softly about the right ratio of vitriol to gall. Navigators compare which row scheme is easier to read when the table jumps 32 points to the circle, or the more economical 16 with the halves implied. A little industry grows around pricking the centers through, so that each copied sheet lands its geometry with admirable certainty. Somewhere always there is a boy cleaning a ruler with his sleeve, and somewhere else there's a woman with steady hands who gilds the north fleur-de-lis so it will catch lamp light at a particular angle and remind a weary captain what he thought north was. The colors are their own quiet code. Green tends to the southeast lines in some shops, red to the main 8 winds, black to the half points that a meticulous pilot will recognize even when the lamp smokes. The effect, when finished, is not unlike a piece of lace laid over the ocean, a domestic texture on a space that otherwise refuses stitching. Ports teach each other as ports do. A Mallorcan maker might carry his roses to Pisa in a coffer and return with a new way to feather the star's ends. A chart made in Sicily finds itself rolled on a Portuguese table, admired for its neat lettering, copied for the coast that matters most this season. There are signatures in the workmanship that nobody lists but everyone senses. The author who favors pointier stars, the shop that draws ship icons with an extra line in the rigging so they look perpetually alert, the binder who always saves a pale piece of parchment for the area around the Balearics as if to keep that water cool. You can identify a life in the margin. A stain announces a chart that sat through one lumpy dinner. A squirt shows where a lamp leaned. Pinholes at the edges mean it was tacked often and perhaps in a crosswind. There's even the occasional repair with thread that looks domestic next to all this maritime geometry. Later curators noticed these things and called them provenance. Sailors noticed them first and called them useful. If a map's left edge looks as if it has been worried by thumbs, you know which coast the ship's master consulted most. Somewhere in here, the windrose learns to share the page with longitude and latitude, those abstract grids that arrive slowly and then all at once, like polite guests who become owners. The rose does not object, it has good manners. It simply keeps being what it is while the rest of the page acquires arithmetic. Pilots begin to measure more than they feel. Dead reckoning takes on a taste of trigonometry. Rose's lines, once pathways of intention, become visual conveniences to lay on top of the new mathematics. A reminder that for all the measuring, a ship still answers to wind, not to numbers. I find it endearing that long after better compasses and chronometers took command, the rose persisted on charts as decoration that was not merely decorative. Government hydrographic offices kept them because they helped the eye find direction without fuss. Naval officers of the very modern sort educated, precise, instrumented, still like to see a star of winds tucked in the corner like an old friend who remembers your stories from before you learned to tell them properly. When globes grew fashionable in parlors, the painters gave them roses too, sometimes huge ones that floated among the longitudes like sea anemones on a strange tide. People let their fingertips hover over the rose's center as if feeling a soft pulse. It is difficult to resist. There are, of course, little controversies even in so sleepy a subject. How many points should a practical rose truly bear for a ship that does not love close-hauled pretensions? Which set of wind names outranks which the Arabic-leaning lexicon of the Levant, the romance stew of the Western Mediterranean, the stern northern saga of north-northeast and east-northeast? Copyists occasionally misplace a label, and debates unspool that last longer than the voyage that prompted them. My favorite footnote concerns a chart where Tramontana is given a flourish so extravagant that a later owner blotted it with brown ink, perhaps out of annoyance, perhaps out of jealousy for its arrogance. Another chart's rose was touched up long after by a tidy hand that ran out of vermilion halfway through the main 8 winds and finished in a cheaper red that faded faster. The winds, unbothered, kept their bearings. Meanwhile, the image of the 8 principal points, north, northeast, east, and so on sat down in the minds of people far from the sea and refused to leave. City planners borrowed the rose and called it a star for paving stones. Church builders snuck a compass rose into a floor where visiting children could be reliably distracted. Even garden designers found it useful to mark a lawn with a star, so one could plant lavender where the wind would carry the smell toward a bench. The rose meanders into the land the way sea smell does on a damp morning subtly, from everywhere at once. The quietest fact, which is the one most likely to tuck you in, is that everything about the rose assumes the world is round without ever needing to say so. Sailors draw straight-seeming lines across a curved surface, knowing the lines are lies that behave nicely over modest distances. The rose participates in this good faith fiction, and nobody is offended. It is as if the chart and the ocean had agreed to meet halfway for the sake of progress and sleep. When the rose multiplies across a portolan in its neat grid of stars, it becomes a kind of knitting, a mesh to keep a moving mind from slipping entirely. The more you look, the more you notice the human scale of all the decisions. Here a line wobbles because a hand wobbled. There a line is thinner because the quill tip had worn and did not wish to be refreshed. In another place a line is oddly bold, which might mean the chart maker leaned forward when the bell struck and came down too firm. We are not supposed to notice these things, but we do, and then we keep the noticing to ourselves as a small private companionship with the long-dead person who made the page. By the time chronometers make longitude a solved riddle and steam renders wind a negotiation rather than a rule, the rose could have retired politely. It does not. Modern charts keep a neat, pared-down version, with the magnetic variation noted as a small, crisp angle, a concession to a world that insists on telling the truth with numbers. In pilot books and yachting manuals, the rose returns as a teaching device, a way to explain that east-northeast is comfortably halfway between east and northeast, but feels under the hand on the tiller more like northeast with the fondness for east than the other way around. Designers, unable to resist a good emblem, engrave roses on brass deck plates and hotel carpets and weather vanes. They end up on coffee mugs where people rest spoons, and on doormats that ask boots to imagine they are on a gangway. If you walk through a museum shop after looking at maps, you can buy a windrose on anything flat. It still works, even there. In your kitchen, north is wherever your cupboard is, and the fleur-de-lis points toward tea. At the very end of this drowsy survey, return to the first desk, the one with the glue and the little bowl of color. The cartographer has finished a new rose and is touching the tips with a shade that may be verdigris, or maybe a substitute because verdigris turned out to be moody and humid weather. He will add one more star somewhere else on the sheet because a captain once complained that the only rose was just out of reach when the table was set with food and the chart had to negotiate with bread. On the street outside his window, someone sells oranges and shouts a price that sounds like a wing name if you don't speak the language. The mapmaker smiles without admitting it. He has inked a world of directions for people who will never meet him, then added a small emblem to whisper that direction is a choice taken repeatedly rather than a fate suffered once. Good pilots already know this. The roses are there to remind them when the lamp fumes and the ship complains, and the voice of the bow says nothing but the same small splash and the same small rhythm for hours. There is a concept in old sailing that feels like a suitable lullaby: to keep a good offing, which means to stay prudently away from land you can't see well yet. The windrose is the geometry of a good offing. It is a careful distance made visible, a means of not hurrying toward anything merely because it is there. You lay your course along one of its rays and promise to look again in a while. That perhaps is why the rose has survived all the upgrades. It embodies the ancient luxury of not deciding too precisely. In a world that measures almost everything to too many decimals, the rose offers a dignified approximation. It says, choose an angle that seems right and re-evaluate after soup. It says, if the wind remembers you kindly, you'll arrive near enough to your intention to recognize it. And if you don't, there will be another line that looks good in a few minutes, and you can try that one without apology. If you are still listening, let the lines fade to pale threads, and the old wind names become nothing more than the sound your breath makes when it slows. The star at the center of the rose, that neat little knot of crossing, is not a command. It is a pause, a point from which you could go anywhere later, a hush with angles. The old pilot with the glazed eyes counting under his breath taps the glass and turns it. The sand deals itself from one bolt to the other, as if to say again that time at sea is mostly waiting done carefully. Somewhere far away, rain chooses a direction on its own. The chart on the table holds its place with 4 pins and does not mind the lamp. The fleur-de-lis winks because you are looking. The ship, if there is a ship, leans a little to starboard for no reason that needs naming. The rose keeps all the ways open at once and asks nothing further than that you pick one when you re-ready, that you keep a good offing, that you change your mind gently when the wind does, and that you remember there will be another line, another angle, another small decision among the many small decisions that turn into arrival without anyone quite noticing when the arriving began. You might not expect the soft clink of little iron chains to be the sleepiest sound in the Middle Ages, but there it is. A row of books tied to a desk like patient geese, barely moving, rustling only when a page turns and a link settles. Imagine a small room with thick walls, a stone floor that remembers winter, and windows that are not interested in letting in much. The air smells of beeswax polish, dust as fine as flour, and a hint of warmed leather. Someone has beaten the rushes on the floor to make them less crunchy. On long slanted boards called lecterns sit the books, each one fitted with a brass hasp, a strap, and a chain secured to a bar. They cannot wander. They do not need to. Readers come to them like supplicants to a well. If you are somehow still awake by the time we reach the discussion of the standard length of a wink, feel free to subscribe, or merely agree with yourself to remember that you meant to, but truly do not strain. The books will be here either way, and the chains are famously patient. The first thing the chains teach is how heavy a book is when it decides to be. A proper folio Bible, thick as 2 hands placed together, weighed enough to convince your elbows that devotion had a price. The chain, usually of wrought iron or sometimes brass if the priory had a generous patron, ran from a clasp on the backboard to the iron rod beneath the shelf. Each chain was made of alternating long and short links, a sort of practical rhythm, long to allow movement, short to keep the metal honest and the book close. A locksmith or blacksmith cut and hammered each link closed, slid it through a ring fixed to the book, then riveted a plate onto the backboard so that the chain would not tear the wood when someone read with enthusiasm. The chain always attached to the lower cover near the spine, so that when a reader pulled the volume forward, the book would not twist itself sick. The result was a choreography almost tender. The book slid, the chain lifted, and the reader and the book met halfway at the slope of the desk. People who imagine medieval life as a shouting match with history are always surprised at how much of it asks for quiet persistence. The chain library is an expert at the long pause. It does not hurry knowledge or dramatize it. The chains mean that the books cannot be borrowed in the modern sense. Instead, one borrows a posture standing or sitting at a fixed place, bending steadily, tracing lines with a finger, letting the thought settle the way dust settles. Domestic details creep in because they refuse to stay out. Winter means fingerless gloves. Summer means the bees wander in and try to measure the wax polish with their feet. The candles smoke at different rates, and the librarian pretends not to notice which readers have learned to choose the clean-burning tallow. On fast days, the room smells like ink and resolute cabbage. On feast days, someone forgets a cup of spiced ale. A monk finds it in the afternoon and quietly writes a marginal note condemning negligence. The chain gives the books a mild personality, a small tug to say hello, a little scrape to say turn me gently, a clack to register disagreement with a hasty reader. Most chains were not identical, which makes them soothing to catalog. Some were square in section, some round. Some had slightly twisted links because a particular smith liked to finish the iron with flair. The locks were delightfully ordinary. No one expected a thief to pick a lock at the desk while the sacristan was watching. The idea was not to defeat a mastermind, but to slow down a gleeful amateur. Many books had a tiny hasp with a separate key, but more often the plate on the backboard was riveted permanently and the chain itself slipped over the bar, through a ring secured with a long sliding bolt at the end of the shelf. The bolt had a wedge or a pin, and the pin lived on the librarian's belt the way a pen might live behind an ear. When it rained hard, the metal gathered a fretful condensation. Someone, likely a novice with good cheer, would rub the links with a cloth and a touch of oil. The sound was a cat's purr disguised as work. The idea of chaining books, which sounds severe until you realize how expensive books were, spread not like wildfire, but like ivy steadily, politely, along the stones it loved. Monasteries put iron bars on the undersides of their lectern shelves and hung books from them. Cathedral schools followed, because students have always been equal parts curious and forgetful. Towns began to maintain libraries in their parish churches where tradesmen could come, when the bell allowed, to read sermons, legal formularies, herbal remedies, and the occasional unexpected epic that had somehow made friends with a shelf. In England, Hereford and Wimborne and Zutphen on the continent became quiet, celebrities among quiet people because their chains survived. In some places, the chains were long enough to let a book travel the whole length of the desk, so two people could read at once, which looked accidental but was deliberate. Sharing is an old technology that predates social media by a millennium and is much kinder to the eyes. Because the room is calm, one begins to notice the small absurdities that delighted medieval readers the way small absurdities delight us. A popular method of protecting a book from damp was to stretch a little skin over the head of the spine like a cap. When the binding grew old and the cap wrinkled, the chain would sometimes snag on the edge, and there would follow a gentle negotiation between reader and iron that a modern person might mistake for incompetence, but which was actually a tiny seasonal ritual. In some libraries, the chain entered the book through a metal ring attached to a strap that could be unbuckled. The strap had a tongue that needed feeding through a hole. The hole needed moving every few years when the leather gave a little. The librarian kept an awl for this purpose and a short litany of acceptable words to say when the awl slipped. Readers had a favorite desk, the way modern people have a favorite chair. Some desks developed small grooves where rings and chain links had worried them for decades like a dog worrying a toy. When the sun did visit, improbably, it found all the iron and drew thin lines of light along it so that the room looked as if it were quietly stringing a harp. A chain library does not simply hold theology, though it holds an ocean of it. It also holds schedules, and the schedules are comfortingly repetitive. Prime, terse, sex, nun, bells as timekeepers, reading between offices. A small pause for copying, a slightly larger pause for mending. In universities, statutes laid down rules about who might read what and when. Not always because of danger, more often because of scarcity and the human talent for queuing badly. One finds notes that say a master may consult a particular commentary only in the presence of two fellows, and the chain, visible and audible, helps the statue remember itself. Here and there, a reader scratches a prayer in the margin sometimes for a soul, sometimes for the success of a harvest, sometimes for better weather in the scriptorium, because the ink is behaving like molasses. The chain makes a small underline below the note as it slides across the board, You could almost call it collaboration. The economics hiding behind the metal links are the opposite of violent, but they are definite. A book asks for months of a scribe's life and the hides of many animals. The binding needed wood, leather, and brass. To lose a volume was not a tragedy, just an inconvenience of a splendid size. Monasteries wrote borrowing contracts on sheets that read like wedding vows. The borrower promises to return the item in good condition and to pay a sum, or to replace the book with another of equal value should disaster appear disguised as whether carelessness or the borrower's sudden desire to keep the book and pretend he never knew it. Chains lowered the blood pressure of everyone involved. You need not invent elaborate penalties if the object in question cannot leave the room. The energy saved by not worrying too much about your neighbor, as honesty could be redirected toward complaining about the ink again, which is a medieval hobby on a par with gardening. At this point, a small technical matter presents itself like a house cat walking into a meeting. The standard length of chain required so that a book could be opened comfortably while not allowing it to do anything whimsical, like travel to the next desk. Surviving examples suggest lengths of roughly 5 to 8 centimeters, with a total extended length of perhaps 70 to 80. But the numbers float the way most numbers do before someone decides to nail them down with a committee. The width of the desk mattered, the ambition of the reader mattered. The book's own temperament mattered most. Heavier books needed shorter chains so the shelf would not sulk under the weight when 3 of them were pulled forward at once. Light books receive longer chains because optimism feels better in the hand. Where a library had grown from many gifts, you could read the generosity of the donors in the metal, the oversized chain that arrived with a particularly large canon law, the shy slender chain that came with a small herbal, the proper unshowy chain of a grammar book that had been read into politeness. All of this might make you suspect the chain scratched the books. Surprisingly, they did not, or not badly. Bindings were thick-skinned, literally. They liked handling. They did not fuss over small indignities. When a chain did leave a mark, it left a crescent bruise on the backboard near the hinge, which is now a curator's clue and a curator's quiet pleasure. The metalwork on some bindings, especially those of prosperous houses, was elaborate enough that a chain's presence improved the appearance by giving the brass something to talk to. The fastening plate might be chased with a vine, a lion, a little running dog. The chain would adopt the conversation and add small exclamation points in dull iron. The whole effect, to a modern eye, is one of purposeful domestication, as if the book were a beautifully kept animal that has agreed to live indoors. There were moments, of course, when a book needed to travel a synod, a court case, a royal query from someone with a seal. Then the chain either said goodbye politely or went on the journey as jewelry. Librarians kept spare rivets, spare rings, spare straps, the way cyclists keep inner tubes. There's a pleasant piece of bureaucracy in some records. A note of the weight of the chain announces, as if to remind everyone that knowledge comes with hardware. Another note instructs that the key to the bar be kept by no fewer than 2 people at once, neither superior to the other, to prevent mischief and to preserve friendship. You cannot improve on that. Somewhere in the same ledger is a marginal drawing of a key with an ornamented bow that looks like a trefoil. You can almost hear the clerk smiling while he drew it, pleased to be particular about something the weather could not ruin. If you stand very still in such a room and read even a small amount of time into the air, you begin to notice the way chain libraries choreograph the body. One learns to lean one's weight into the desk just enough that the chain hangs neatly and does not chatter. The elbows find that famous monkish angle, the back the midpoint between attention and resignation. Turning a page becomes a 2-step. Lift the corner, draw the chain a finger's breadth to slacken, settle both. The copyist's cough belongs to the background, like the ticking of a clock that is not actually there. Even the sound of a quill being sharpened takes on a comforting predictability. You come to recognize the book by the way its chain behaves. The psalter on the far left sings a little when you slide it. The commentary on Lombard clacks firmly like a magistrate clearing his throat. The herbal near the window purrs softly, either because its chain was made by a gentler smith, or because the leaves of the plants drawn inside it prefer not to be hurried. We should let a few characters drift in, not as heroes, but as companions in monotony. There is the parish clerk who comes after dinner to practice his letters using a chained copy of Priscian, moving his lips in a way that would scandalize a modern reading instructor but calms his own mind marvelously. A merchant's son, sent to learn enough Latin to interpret invoices really meant for his father, props a chained grammar on the lowest desk and discovers, with the mild surprise of a person finding an extra turnip, that he enjoys ablative absolutes. A widow from the town, allowed in on market days by a kindly verger, runs her finger down a chained book of hours and whispers aloud in office as if it were a recipe that always turns out well. A bailiff who is not expected to enjoy reading at all consults a chained legal formulary with the expression of a man checking the weather through a keyhole and leaves a scrap of wax on the desk that becomes a fossil within the hour. Just when the scene risks turning sentimental, the chains quietly assert their practical side again. In a storm, the windows leak, the rushes smell like a creek bed, and the librarian throws a cloth over the books near the wall. He knows exactly how far each chain allows the book to travel, and folds the cloth just so the chain holds the edge in place, and somewhere the cloth becomes a shield against flies. In a renovation, the books are shifted and the iron rods moved. The holes left by the bolts become a dotted line across the underside of the shelf, tiny memorials to an earlier arrangement that only the shelf and the chains recall. If a mouse dares to explore, it meets a link with its whiskers and decides the library has too many opinions. Nothing in the room is dramatic and everything remembers. Eventually, inevitably, the chains begin to look old-fashioned. Printing makes more books. Locks grow smaller. Borrowing becomes a habit. The chain libraries do not take offense. They diminish with the same dignity with which they kept watch. Some are dismantled slowly, the bars reused as window grills. The chains saved for curious children to rattle. The books were bound without plates and sent to new shelves that expect to be dusted. But in a few places, the old arrangement is kept because it is easier to keep it than to explain why it should be changed. This is how we inherit most of our best museum pieces from laziness carefully practiced. Centuries later, visitors walk into a narrow room in Hereford or Zutphen, and the air changes its mind about modernity. The chains are still there, a thin iron murmur from people who measured their lives by bells. There is a modern echo that pleases me. In reading rooms where pencils are still issued like passports, librarians tether them to the desk with a little cord. Patrons smile at the cord, then at the bookstand, then at themselves. On ferries, the public binoculars are fitted with a braided cable that says kindly, "You may gaze as far as you like, but bring the gaze back." Even in kitchens, the measuring spoons that refuse to separate from each other behave like a very small chain library committed to accurate cinnamon. We did not abandon the idea of attaching useful things to other useful things. We merely changed the materials and the tone of voice. When we step back from the iron for a last look, what remains is not the quaintness, but the pace. A chained book proposes that reading is a place, not an action. You go to it the way you go to a well. You do not carry the well home in a bucket. You carry yourself to the well, and then you carry the water. The chain reminds you where the well is when your eyes wander. It is, in a way, an early user interface design element, a visible affordance that tells you what the object wants to do and what it refuses to do. It wants you to read here under this light, at this slope, with this posture, for as long as the candle and your attention agree. It refuses to let you multitask in the market or on a bench. It believes, silently and without theology, That concentration enjoys furniture. The room dims a little as evening draws an outline around the windows. Someone tidies the desks with a cloth, which makes the chain sigh and settle. A single book remains half open, its chain a gentle arc, as if caught mid-gesture. The librarian sets a wooden wedge between its leaves so that tomorrow it will recognize itself and not begin at the wrong place. He slides the bolt at the end of the shelf. The iron rings answer with a small sequence of clicks that is their way of saying good night. The door closes with that wooden medieval sound that modern doors envy. Outside, ordinary weather resumes. Inside, the chains go slack and dream of nothing. The well waits where it is, markedly patient. If you decide to return, and there is no rush, you will find your place by the mark the chain has made, a soft trace in the wood, a permission to continue exactly where you left off, in a room that measures time by the length of a candle and the quiet insistence of metal being metal, again and again, as if permanence were not an argument but a temperament. You might not expect a handful of torn parchment, a few neat lines in Ottoman Turkish, and an elegant coastline that wanders where no sailor. Should have been to keep anyone awake, and yet here we are blinking at a map that behaves like a polite riddle. Picture a quiet table in a museum, the light flat and patient, the glass case refraining from fogging even when visitors lean too close. On the vellum seas are the color of faded tea-ships puff along on little breaths of painted wind and along the edges. In a steady clerkly hand, a navigator explains himself as if the ocean had asked him to sign for a delivery. He says he compared 20 charts. He says some were Arabic, some Portuguese, a few from quite secret places that would prefer not to be named. He writes in the calm, clipped way of a man who has learned that precise sentences save arguments. The date he gives is 1513. The man is Piri, nephew to a corsair, admiral to a sultan, collector of rumor and rudders and fragments. He is not dramatic about any of it. He simply builds a coastline by setting the edges of the known world together the way you press the torn lips of paper into alignment to see if they still belong. If you're somehow still awake a few minutes from now, when we reach the part about a shoreline that looks suspiciously like ice without the ice, you can subscribe or just breathe in slowly and decide that you approve. Either method is historically unobjectionable. It helps to begin on the Bosphorus when the water is keeping its temper, and the gulls are only moderately convinced that every ship holds fish. Piri Reis walks the quays, listening to men who have listened to other men. He grew up at sea, a life measured in canvas and salt-cured rope, but he has a bureaucrat's respect for neat bundles of paper. In his mind, the Mediterranean is a set of rooms opening into each other, the Aegean with its inconvenient furniture of islands, the Tyrrhenian with its admiring view of volcanoes, the Western Strait like a door that stubbornly sticks, then gives with a sigh. He collects Portuguese notes with the appetite of a man shopping for spices after lunch, cheerful, thorough, and sure he will use everything. He has Columbus on his table, or says he does, which is almost the same thing, a chart like a rumor made into geometry. There are Arabic portolans with compass roses that bloom like disciplined fireworks, and there are Portuguese rudders, which are more like very confident grocery lists. Sail so many leagues on such a wind until a certain smell arrives, then turn until the sun decides to sit on your right shoulder, and there you are. He writes marginalia to say where he stitched his seam, noting who told him what and how loudly. He has the tone of a sailor who finds his way by addition rather than intuition. He believes that if you stack enough small certainties together, you get something that stands up. Of the original whole world, he promised, we have only the western hem of it, a generous curve from Iberia down past the bulge of Africa, and then across into a new world that was very new to the people who gave the museums their money. The rest of Piri's chart vanished into the repertory of palace fires and busy hands. The surviving fragment is just enough to tease. Along the Atlantic, his coastlines hoard their little bays. Rivers open their mouths where you would expect. Islands arrange themselves like good students. The paint sits thin on the vellum, uninterested in drama. There is a pleasing absence of the medieval habit of drawing dragons wherever knowledge fails. The sea here is practical, almost municipal. And the notes. Oh, the notes. The ship's gossip turned into footnotes. He writes that some Indians are reddish and friendly, that a Portuguese pilot said something astonishing in a tavern, that a certain island behaves itself and can be trusted not to move. A map whose voice is reasonable is a map you want to trust. You might even forgive it for the way the parchment ends like a sentence interrupted, the edge a little burnt, the text cut mid-remark, as if the admiral had been called from his desk to answer a bell. Then the southern edge arrives the way a low cloud arrives, without raising its voice, and the room shifts. It is a smooth, improbable line, a coast too tidy for an age that preferred its discoveries to come with several errors. Some see in that line the margin of a continent that ought to be wearing ice. They squint, and they say they recognize the way Queen Maud Land lays her long arm. They consult modern seismic surveys, those polite earthquakes we coax into, telling us what lies under the white, and they murmur that the old line knows things it should not. Enthusiasts lean in as if the map can hear them and praise it for a kind of cartographic clairvoyance. Skeptics take 3 steps back, then 2 forward, and point out that Renaissance map makers often drew a southern land on principle the way pastry cooks dust sugar on anything that seems to need finishing. Terra Australis, the ancient counterweight that kept the world from tipping, what better place to put it than right where the parchment is most empty? They suggest that the elegant shoreline is simply a stretched Patagonia, hawked into a cape by the draftsman's hand. They say that resemblance is neighborly to coincidence. The map, of course, offers no comment. It lets the ink sit, lets the curve hum to itself, and does not mind being misunderstood. We drift on, neither persuaded nor offended, which is an underrated luxury. Elsewhere the map becomes chatty again, and the chatter is quietly astonishing. River mouths find their future locations with a confidence that looks like cheating. Tiny islands float where later voyages confirm they ought to float. A note remarks on red-skinned people whose hospitality resembles that of early Spanish reports, and whose existence was not exactly a secret in Andalusian taverns, though it was not official either. When the coastline wobbles, it wobbles in believable ways, like a person remembering a path rather than inventing one. You can almost feel Piri's desk vibrating with secondhand certainty, pilot's talk pressed into diagrams, a seafaring version of gossip that hardens into data because so many voices repeated it soberly. He had sources he trusted and sources he distrusted with affection. He treats the Portuguese like a man who admires a rival company's ledger impeccably kept, slightly smug and useful beyond any confession. This is the point in our drifting where suspicion begins to put on its slippers. If the southern edge glances towards something that resembles Antarctica without its hat, if river mouths remember themselves centuries early, if little islands behave with uncanny good manners, perhaps Piri's pile of sources held a few documents older than the ink would have you believe. Enthusiasts of lost libraries elbow their way politely into the conversation and ask whether Alexandria's vanished shelves sent out a few books disguised as living memories. They wonder whether Phoenician pilots, who told the truth when it mattered and embellished it when it did not, left logbooks in places that were very good at keeping secrets. Every age likes to imagine that the one just before it knew more than it said, the way we tend to believe grandparents had a method we cannot quite understand. Skeptics roll a shoulder and point to the Greco-Roman geographers who guessed well by using mathematics and a patient stare at the horizon. A portolan is not a prophecy, they say. It is just a clever average of experience. The map itself, placed under calm light, continues to not object. Around here, the conspiracies arrive with their shoes cleaned and their hair combed. They tend to speak softly. Perhaps they say, great courts kept great maps quiet because monopolies on trade prefer the silence to do their work. Portugal had a pattern of standing slightly in the doorway to keep the draft of knowledge from ruffling anyone else's papers. Spain had a habit of reading aloud, only the parts of discovery that made for good sermons. Patrons liked to lock drawers. Astronomers who drew with steady hands and sailors who steered with steady nerves might have found it sensible to share some things only at sea. There is even in the back rooms of these theories a nice tidy idea about magnetic declination and copy error about how a practiced chart maker slipping. A degree here and there can create a harmony of outlines that convinces a modern eye the ancient chart knew too much, when in fact it merely knew how to look related to itself. It is as if the map had a kind of family resemblance, a set of features repeated with enough confidence that we much later mistake inheritance for foresight. Still, the notion of missing charts lingers like a scent in a stairwell. Piri himself writes that he used Columbus's map, which in itself feels like rummaging through a famous pocket and coming up with a coin that jingles convincingly. He says a captured pilot talked, which is what pilots do when they're captured and treated kindly enough. He hints that the Sultan would appreciate the width of the Atlantic drawn with fewer arguments. He does not mention Atlantis, which is a relief, nor does he call on gods who prefer to remain allegorical. He does, however, draw little animals on a few coasts, and their expressions are so cordial that one can imagine them offering fruit. Scholars point out that the animals were most likely borrowed from other maps, the way a cook borrows a big garnish. And yet, the overall impression the page gives, when one stops arguing with it and simply sits, is that this is a work done by a professional who liked footnotes. Modern science, which has its own rituals and its own patient candles, takes a turn at the table. Under careful light, the pigments confess their age. The ink behaves like ink that has spent 500 years considering its life choices. Multispectral imaging, which is a sophisticated way of asking a document to show us what it meant to write and erase and write again, reveals notes beneath notes, corrections that feel like a hand touching its own memory. Where coastlines look too good to be true, geodesists gently point out the wiggles that give the game away. Where coastlines look doubtful, they point to the parts that line up anyway, like a choir finding a tune. There are measurement errors exactly where you would expect them if a man in 1513 spent many hours coaxing 20 sources into handshake agreements. There are bursts of precision that suggest a pilot had a very good day and was not shy about telling others. The verdicts, when written down, are delightfully unexcited. The map is as remarkable as it looks. Not everything on it is remarkable. Copying creates echoes. Echoes can sound like prophecies if you listen with your eyes closed. If any of it were truly explosive, it would have had a harder time surviving. Yet the map drifted through the centuries in the Ottoman treasury, then in the long corridors of museums, not so much suppressed as simply stored. Courts that wanted secrecy kept it with ledgers and privileges, not with bonfires. There were indeed redacted margins and other archives pages quietly glued together because monopolies. Just like oxygen, but here in Piri's case, the document as survival depended on a familiar concept. There are always more papers than there are clerks. The map sat, folded, patient as a floor tile. When it emerged, it did what quiet artifacts do. It gathered well-meaning theories the way a wool coat gathers burrs, without ever needing to choose among them. What remains for us is the bedtime version of the question, which is always nicer than the courtroom version. Suppose Piri really did stitch together fragments whose grandparents saw farther than we thought. Suppose a pilot from a caravanserai of ideas handed him a memory older than the ink. Would it matter except in the way that a gentle fact improves the weather of your day? The ocean does not change because one admiral wrote neat notes. The ice wears its hat regardless. That the map becomes a kind of lullaby about how knowledge travels when it cannot travel, openly folded into other documents, smuggled by friendship, written as a marginal remark waiting for someone who likes footnotes. The image of Piri at his desk returns, a man weighing one coastline against another as if they were loaves, nudging a river mouth slightly until it looks right, congratulating himself with a modest sip of coffee that does not yet exist, then deciding tea is what he meant. We can dally a little with the craftsmanship, because craft is the least controversial part of a mystery and often the most comforting. Vellum is skin trained to behave like paper. It tightens when the weather changes, and maps bend their edges like cats arching spines on chilly mornings. The pigments had their own temperaments. Verdigris soaked in damp, red lead cheerfully demanded attention, carbon black sat in the corner and refused to react. The pens were reeds sharpened to a line as thin as responsibility. The compass points pricked the skin and left pinhole scholars now count like old stars. The wind roses, those dainty compulsions of the Portolan tradition, would have been rolled with string and a practiced wrist, their petals labeled with winds that felt local and personal. You can hear the scratch, scratch, lift, turn, scratch. The map is not just an image. It is the record of hands not hurrying. Back at the southern edge, the smooth line keeps smiling politely. A person determined to be thrilled will be thrilled. A person determined to be skeptical will be satisfied. The map doesn't mind either way. The sensible middle, where sleep lives, notes that the curve is a provocation measured in millimeters. If it were truly Antarctica, the ice would need to have stepped off stage recently, and ice is not known for discreet exits. If it is a guess, it is a very graceful guess. If it is a stretched Patagonia, it is stretching after a voyage and feeling better for it. Meanwhile, the tiny ships continue to puff along. The notations mention a Portuguese pilot, the way a recipe mentions a pinch of something, and the islands sit like punctuation in a long maritime sentence that was always going to be revised. There is one more small delight that the map shares with anyone patient enough to notice. Its maker assumes that the world makes sense when approached with care. He is not a prophet with a banner. He is a clerk with a ruler. He believes that sheer accumulation will do the trick, that 20 imperfect accounts will cancel one another's errors better than a single dramatic tale will. This belief ages well. It produces charts that are good enough for ships and still good enough for museums, which is a handsome return on investment. It also produces an odd comfort. When people argue about the map, they are really arguing about how the world decides what it knows. Do we trust the slow pile of evidence? Or do we prefer the beautiful story that explains all the corners at once? The map leans toward the pile and lets the story address the pile modestly. Night deepens in the gallery, or seems to. The glass reflects the ceiling lamps like small moons. Those who came expecting thunder find that the thunder has opted to become a low, steady hum of questions that will neither be solved nor go away. The map is pleased with this arrangement. It was made to be used and then to be argued about, not to be solved like a riddle with a prize. Outside, modern coastlines continue to exist at their usual addresses. Inside, a 16th century admiral smiles in absent ink and leaves us with a series of courteous maybes. Perhaps he had Columbus on his desk. Perhaps an older chart strolled across his table disguised as a newer one. Perhaps the southern curve is a ghost of ice. Perhaps it is simply what happens when a professional with a calm hand and an interest in being precise runs out of parchment at an interesting moment. If you are still awake, the map will allow you one more glance. You notice the neat Ottoman script along the margins, the confidence in the way a word sits after another word, the assurance that notes, like breadcrumbs, will be useful to someone. You notice the pinpricks where a compass rose helped measure a rum line. You notice that the ships are all moving, none at anchor, because maps prefer action when they are pretending to be still. You notice that the tier along the edge looks like a coastline of its own, a negative shore beyond, which is only museum table. Then the noise of the room fades to the whisper of conditioned air. A case closes, a guard yawns. A visitor decides that a cup of something warm would be practical. The map stays where it is lightly impressive, gently improbable, and completely content to be a piece of vellum that invites you to drift along its beaches until the beaches of sleep arrive very slowly, like a tide that has memorized its work and intends to do nothing more than what it always does, which is enough. You might not expect the angle at which a piece of metal spirals around a rod to make anyone feel drowsy, and yet here we are, lulled by the gemless geometry. Imagine a workbench that smells faintly of oil and warm iron, the kind of bench with a drawer that will never fully close because the hex key has resigned itself to living at the back. On the bench lies a shiny bolt and a quiet nut, two objects so content in their purpose that they never ask to be noticed. They meet only by agreement. A thread on the bolt whispers to the thread in the nut, asking very politely whether they might go for a walk together in one direction and only one direction. And the nut replies that this sounds acceptable, provided the angle and the spacing are correct. If you're still awake when I reach the part where someone argues for an angle of exactly 55 degrees, feel free to subscribe or to soften your focus and let the numbers drift past like polite pigeons. Either is supportive of the historical project. The story owes a debt to craftsmen who didn't set out to be characters in a bedtime narrative. A long time ago, say, in an era when a workshop was mostly light, dust, and a kettle that complained the threads on screws were the personality of the person who made them. A blacksmith would cut a spiral by eye, which is to say by memory and patience. You can picture him turning a file the way a baker turns icing, not because it was the only way, but because it was his way. Every screw had a dialect. If the screw and its matching nut were separated, both would pine quietly for the other and refuse to cooperate with any new partner. This gave screws an oddly romantic reputation, but it was terrible for industry. Then 1810 ambled in with a man named Henry Maudslay, who perfected a lathe with a lead screw and in the calmest possible way told metal that it could now repeat itself. Repeat itself exactly. A treadle, a gear, a carriage, and the steady fall of cutting oil. A thread no longer guessed at, but generated. The screw was domesticated not by force, but by rhythm. Once repeatability arrived, the next thought was, of course, that repeating something in 1,000 different ways was still a bit chaotic. Enter Joseph Whitworth, a man from Manchester who owned a measuring temperament. He believed in flatness, straightness, and an angle that could be written down and then expected to behave. He looked at the riot of thread forms, sharp triangles, rounded crests, casual spirals, and he proposed a compromise with the firmness of a clerk who has decided where the files should go. 55 degrees as the thread angle, with gentle rounded tops and bottoms, so the metal would not cut itself on its own enthusiasm. He offered pitches and tidy steps, a family of sizes that shared a last name. Somewhere, 1,000 nuts relaxed, and 1,000 bolts felt understood. It wasn't romantic in the old artisan sense, but it was deeply companionable, of course. As soon as one person lays out a system with this much neatness, someone else appears to admire it and then improve it into a different system. Across the Atlantic, William Sellers took a look and said that 60 degrees had a certain moral clarity. The American standard would be flatter on paper and practical on the shop floor. The crests and roots would be squared off with a relief, easy for tools to make and machinists to inspect with a tiny triangular gauge that behaved like a skeptical eyebrow. Both systems worked. Both had advocates who could quote tolerances the way poets quote birdsong. And while the rest of the world would eventually welcome metric threads with their own soothing pitch series, this was enough for a century to busy itself. A gentle struggle of angles in which nobody raised their voice above the whir of belts. If you examine a thread too closely, Perhaps, but let's be honest. We are here for that. You'll find that its confidence depends on very small habits. The pitch is the distance from one crest to the next. The lead is how far the nut travels in one revolution, which in a single start thread is the same as the pitch, but can be more in a multi-start thread that cheerfully carries several spirals at once like a rope with companions. There is the minor diameter where the valleys meet, and the major where the hills shake hands. There's flank angle, which is the technical way of saying how steeply the sides climb, and a helix angle that watches how the thread wraps around the cylinder like a stripe on a barber's pole. None of this is dramatic. It is patient geometry that behaves itself right up to the moment two parts cut wrong, and then is a whisper of regret you can feel in your fingertips. There are also, for those who enjoy mild curiosities, left-handed threads. These exist because sometimes the world insists on turning the other way. The pedals on bicycles, for instance, demonstrate their preference for not unthreading themselves with every ride by assigning the left one a left-hand thread. Gas fittings used for certain flammable gases also favor this contrarian spiral, ensuring that you cannot, in a sleepy hour, mistake them for the more civic-minded oxygen. Left-hand threads are not rebellious. They are helpful in an understated way, like a label in a carefully maintained drawer. And then there are acme threads, trapezoidal and deliberate, designed for power screws to carry loads without complaint, and square threads, older cousins who promise maximum efficiency but ask for more meticulous machining than most shops enjoy on a Tuesday. The world of threads features buttresses that lean one way to resist force in a single direction, and very fine threads that tiptoe along thin-walled tubes because a coarse thread would bite too greedily. If you press your ear to the workbench figuratively, please you can hear all these forms arguing their case with the politeness of a committee meeting where the biscuits are excellent. Committees did arrive inevitably. They tend to appear just after invention and just before complaint. In 1841, British standards gathered themselves, shook hands with Whitworth, and made a case for uniformity that was, in its way, musical. Later, America blessed sellers with its official favor, and machine shops learned to keep multiple gauges in the same drawer without letting them quarrel. The French, with a metric comb, organized threads according to a system that could be counted on one's fingers and then on 10 more if necessary. The Germans refined, the Swiss refined the refinement, and somewhere an inspector with a magnifier the size of a pocket watch nodded at a set of perfect crests and went home. Satisfied. It is sometimes suggested, very gently and with the conspiratorial air appropriate to midnight machinery, that standards are how empires mark their path. A bolt that fits everywhere is a kind of passport. Companies that own the taps and dies, or the patents for the angles of their gauges, enjoyed a quiet monopoly on certainty. Railways discovered this principle with track gauges. Workshops discovered it in thread forms. There were rumors, never particularly explosive, that certain firms preferred a threading language others could not speak. Nothing quite villainous, just the normal human affection for captive customers translated into metal. If there was suppression, it wore the face of convenience. The shop ordered what it always ordered. The catalogs offered what the shop expected. The nut and bolt smiled on their wedding day and promised not to complain. Meanwhile, in 1,000 factories and lofts, machines turned. A lathe-led screw sang its slow helical song, driving a carriage with the unromantic grace that builds nations and stair rails. Change gears hung like a small constellation on a wall, waiting to be arranged so that the carriage would move exactly one pitch for every turn of the spindle. Someone kept a notebook of gear combinations, smudged with thumbprints like a family recipe. The workshop language became standardized in the mouth, 20 threads per inch, M10 by 1.5, class to a fit, H3 plug tap, bottoming tap. Mind the swarf. You can feel sleep arriving just there. When the jargon stops meaning and becomes tone, the hum of a world that meets by agreement. Where the threads got interesting again, gently, was at their limits. A submarine may ask for studs that resist both pressure and the sea's habit of tasting everything. The threads must hold and yet yield only to the correct wrench, which in the Navy has an official pedigree. Space agencies found themselves writing tidy documents about how to keep going from turning two expensive parts into a single expensive sculpture. They specified materials, lubricants, and a ritual for tightening in stages so that all the tiny ramped planes on the circumference share the load like a choir shares a note. At the other end of size, microscopes and watchmakers negotiated with threads so fine that a single flake of dust had the self-importance of a pebble. The world at small scale behaves more like cake than like steel. If you want microhooks to stay awake through this, consider jar lids. The thread on a humble mason jar is not Whitworth or Sellers, not metric or pipe. It is a specialized profile that tolerates mashed fruit and impatience. It seals with a ring and a promise. The lid's thread is rolled, not cut, extruded into existence by pressure, and the pitch is friendly to hands. You meet this thread in your kitchen without noticing you are handling an industrial standard that had a committee's afternoon to thank for its quiet success. Or look at garden hoses. The hose bib on a house carries a thread with a name that sounds like a formal greeting. It exists so that, no matter where you move, your hose will screw on and the water will arrive on time. Threads also intersect happily with the story of pipes, where the seal comes from the metal touching metal with a crush and a smear of sealant, rather than from washers. National pipe taper thread, with its subtle cone, asks the fitting to become tighter as it goes deeper, which is a sensible sort of romance. This thread even limited how much brute strength was considered respectable, enough to seal, not so much as to split. Later, straight threads with O-rings brought a tidy, reusable dignity to hydraulics, in which leakage is the world's way of criticizing you. Now and then, an error becomes folklore. Somewhere, a machinist left and right confused, or read 26 as 28, and a part was sent to a field where it would never fit. The story is told and retold with a tone of affectionate caution, and gauges are checked twice. Gauges themselves are a lovely aside, little triangular or serrated tools, stamped with small numbers that let you lay patience against metal and know what has been made. Each sharp tooth is a promise. Each notch is a standardized sigh of relief. Modern metrology speaks of classes of fit that decide how tight or sloppy a screw joint may be. Free-running fits for assemblies that value speed, close fits for parts that must feel carefully guided. Interference fits when two pieces become one with pressure and intention. A gauge labeled 2B suggests ordinary civility. 3B implies a more formal handshake. This language, so gentle in its bureaucracy, moves through procurement forms and inspection sheets like rain through a gutter. It is not exciting, which is why it works. Sleep finds you somewhere between 2A and 3A, as if between second and third helpings. There is also the matter of how threads are made. Cutting with taps and dies is a rite of passage. Tap straight. Use cutting fluid. Back off to break the chip. Do not rush because metal considers hurry a personal insult. Rolling threads with hardened dies cold forms the metal, evening out the grain and giving strength that cut threads do not enjoy. Grinding produces perfect shapes for high loads. Each method has a sound, a gentle scrape, a quiet press, a soft hiss, all of them professionally boring in the best, most soothing sense. Standards, after a century of anyone caring, began to harmonize. International bodies agreed, then agreed again with small addenda, then published charts with columns that dared you to finish them in a single glance. Machine drawings now carry little notes, M1 2 times 1.75 to 6H, that seem like cryptograms until you learn their grammar, after which they read like a shopping list for a very particular dessert. A part made in one hemisphere will match its companion made in another. A long-distance marriage arranged by a table. And yet, even as Bolts grew globally literate, the old local dialects hung about. A restorer's meeting might spend an hour quietly exchanging wisdom about early motorcycle threads, which form a miniature anthropology. Whitworth spanners and American wrenches shared toolboxes with metric sets and polite truce. It is not chaos. It is the fossil record of human preference, hardening into steel 1 century at a time. Behind all this, there is the gentle metaphysics of why a thread holds. The inclined plane around the cylinder multiplies force in a way an apprentice can feel but not need to compute. Friction on the flanks turns tightening into staying put. Elastic stretch in the bolt, that tiny drawn-out mess, becomes a spring that keeps clamping hearts together. When bolts fail, they tell the story along their fractured faces like the grain of wood tells you where a tree leaned. Engineers read these stories the way bookish children read end papers, and then they write specifications that nudge tomorrow into behaving more like yesterday's. Success. It is time now to let the picture widen to domestic scale. Consider the tripod you set up for a quiet photograph. Its head swivel on threads of a size that happens to be known by a camera's entire century. Consider spectacles whose tiny screws get nervous and back away. A small turn of a watchmaker's screwdriver persuades them to stay. Consider a folding chair that needs one more turn to stop wobbling. You give it that turn. It thanks you silently with stability. Consider the space shaft, far above such furniture, whose fasteners are torqued by technicians with gloves and rituals. Those fasteners have personalities. They must not loosen from vibration. They must not cease from vacuum. They must never be asked to do anything dramatic. Standards reach up even there, quiet as dust. And finally, because bedtime prefers a soft mystery, we can ask why 5 degrees mattered enough to argue over. 55 or 60, rounded root or flat, metric or inch. Class of fit this or that, none of it changes human plans in a dramatic sense. Yet, in 1,000 small ways, it changed how easily the plans could be carried out. The choice that seems fussy at drafting tables is the choice that saves hours with socket wrenches on damp afternoons. Whitworth's angle wears tweed. Sellers wears a crisp collar. Metric threads hum a universal tune. All 3 stand together in the drawer, and none of them will complain if you choose another today. They only ask that you keep your gauges in order. If you're still with me, feel the pleasant heaviness of a well-torqued joint settling into place. Somewhere, a tap returns to its sleeve, relieved to rest. A die, its teeth rinsed and dried, looks like a tiny wreath and does not know how charming it is. In a museum of technology, a lathe sits on its pedestals, lead screw gleaming, and you can almost hear the whisper of pitches past. In your kitchen, a jar lid twists home. In your bicycle, a pedal promises not to unscrew itself. In your pocket, a tripod plate waits to be turned 3 times into confidence. The world is quietly fastened by agreements we no longer notice, angles we rarely see, and a bureaucratic courtesy between metal parts that patrols our days for us. We drift out of the workshop. The kettle clicks. The bench creaks because benches always do. The bolt and the nut, those slow dancers, rest within reach. The standards, written in pages the color of tea, keep their promises without applause. All that remains is the sense that someone, long ago, decided the world should be able to put itself together again after being taken apart, and then wrote the angles to make it so. And because of that, lids close, clamps hold, ladders stand, and eyes close, spiraling down along a helix set at exactly the right pitch for sleep. You might not expect a single torn sheet of gazelle-skin parchment to keep cartographers awake at night, but here we are, tiptoeing around a map that acts like it knows things it shouldn't. It lies under glass now, cool and well-behaved, a quiet rectangle with edges that look as if a small, tidy sea has nibbled them. The ink is a brown that used to be black, the paint a modest set of reds and greens that never try to start an argument. If you lean very slightly closer than museum etiquette suggests, you can see tiny Ottoman notes drifting along the margins like polite gossip. The map is attributed to Piri ibn Haji Memd, known to shipmates as Piri Reis, who sailed, measured, borrowed, and copied his way into a kind of fame that feels accidental. He was an admiral's nephew, and then an admiral himself, the sort who could calculate latitude while explaining to a deckhand how to coil a rope so it wouldn't trip anyone later. In 1513, he drew a world on skin, and then, just to be interesting at parties, wrote that part of his coastline came from a chart made by a Genoese named Columbus. If you're still awake when we get to the bit about pigments and parabeaks, feel free to subscribe or simply let your eyes unfocus and imagine the smell of hide glue. Either response is historically appropriate. We only have the left-hand third of the map, which is a shy way for a document to introduce itself. It shows the Atlantic like a long conversation between two coastlines. On one side, West Africa and Iberia curve down in a way with the familiarity of an old friend's signature. On the other, the Caribbean and a slice of South America perform a careful parade of bays, capes, and river mouths. Piri's captions say this bit came from 8 or 10 earlier maps, plus stories that came with the maps, and once you see the layering, you cannot unsee it. Cape Verde Islands sit exactly where they ought to, while some Caribbean islets behave as if they learned geography from a ballad. There are kings on their thrones in miniature, looking pleased with the whole arrangement. There is a stylish parrot, because there is always a parrot when Europeans talk about the New World, and Piri was a thorough borrower of other people's habits. The manuscript's tone is not dramatic. The handwriting is professional rather than poetic, the kind of script that looks like it wears a neat beard. In the margins, he tells us what he used. An Arabic portolan here, a Portuguese letters there, perhaps something that Columbus kept in a chest that everyone swore they never opened. The idea that he compared 20 charts is plausible in the same way that a kitchen drawer can hold 20 wooden spoons if the cook has had a busy life. The truth hides in the way his coastlines compromise. When two sources disagree, Piri chooses a middle path as if he were settling a domestic dispute between capes. Where he is confident, the line is smooth. Where he is cautious, the pen lift becomes a small, thoughtful pause you can still feel 5 centuries later. People like to bring up the oddities. If you draw a ruler along the southern edge, the coast runs as if Antarctica had stepped quietly into the picture without putting on its ice. One theory says this is a ghost of a real shoreline remembered from some very old source. Another says Renaissance mappers sometimes stretched Patagonia until it looked like a ballroom floor because they found empty space discouraging. Shawms and drums for the first idea, a shrug and a ledger for the second. Piri himself, to our lasting frustration, does not come out from behind the ink to explain whether he copied a memory of ice-free land or just made a tasteful guess to keep the composition balanced. At bedtime, both theories behave well. Either will tuck you in with equal professionalism, more persuasive than the southern dreams are the small accuracies that should not be small. At the mouth of the Amazon, rivers do what modern rivers still do. Certain islands stand roughly where they are still standing, looking a little taller because 16th century islands like to be seen from a distance. A few animals wander onto the parchment to make their point strange fish, a pleasantly round seal, something with more personality than zoology. Piri's world is stitched together out of testimony, captured pilots, Andalusian sailors half helpful and half boastful, Arab navigators who could have drawn coast as their sleep if they had chosen to waste good sleep on ink. The map's confidence is not in the lines themselves, but in the way. The lines keep agreeing with one another more often than they disagree. like a chorus of witnesses who can't all be wrong in quite the same way, because it is late, and late is a good hour for conspiracies that fold neatly and stack well. We can entertain the suggestion that Piri tapped into a deeper archive. Alexandria's lost shelves drift into the conversation, though they drift into most conversations if you wait long enough. Phoenician traders appear, nodding as if this is all familiar. A mysterious Greek geographer waves from a ship whose oars keep time with the forgotten equation. The notion is tidy, that ancient surveyors knew the globe better than we assume, and that their knowledge lived on as a series of dog-eared copies. The way a family recipe survives without anyone remembering who first wrote a spoon more in the margin. There are also less romantic, but very serviceable, explanations involving portolan charts so accurate along coasts that they feel modern, combined with coastal pilots who could talk a cartographer through a shoreline over coffee. The map's biography becomes more bureaucratic as it moves through centuries. At some point, the right-hand two-thirds stopped being attached to the left-hand third. Fire is the usual suspect in palaces. So is renovation. Perhaps the absent part became a convenient scrap for wrapping something, as maps sometimes do when kitchens need their help. The survivor slipped into a treasury in top copy, a palace where scribes inked inventory titles with a calm that must have been contagious. In 1929, a librarian one imagines him with sleeves rolled to his elbows and a pencil he refused to sharpen until it could no longer make a line found the fragment, while cataloging other things that had lost their original name tags. The world was living briskly in the 20th century then, just eccentric enough to appreciate an Ottoman map that mentioned Columbus in the margin like a neighbor dot testing came later. Scholars looked at the pigments under comfortable lamps, observed that the red was the kind of red you get from cochineal and iron that have agreed to work together, that the black had gone brown in the way iron gall ink makes a habit of going brown. Under ultraviolet light, the parchment glowed the way parchment glows when it was never trying to be anything else. The handwriting's habit of spacing, the way the diacritics sit, the grammar that chooses one suffix over another, these things lined up with early 16th century Ottoman scribal fashion. When people say the map is authentic, they mean it the way you mean it about a teapot that is not a forgery and pours tea at the correct speed. When people say parts of its geography still raise eyebrows, they mean it the way you mean it about a teapot whose handle is slightly higher than you expected and yet your hand likes it that way. It is soothing to linger over the decorative parts. The wind roses are not extravagant, they are well bred. The rum wines march from them in tidy bundles, pale silk threads over brown. Ships with square sails cruise in waters that do not move. A king sits on his throne on a coast that probably did not host his throne, and a note explains, with professional courtesy, who rules where. Flags unfurl where flags feel at home. On the South American shore, a llama trim and busy pretends not to know it has become a mascot for every lecture on early modern cartography. These pictures do not try to be persuasive. They try to be complete. They tell the user, we have not only measured, we have also looked. At this point in any conversation about Piri Reis, someone mentions Antarctica again, and someone else mentions shoreline versus ice shelves. In a third person, usually the one resting their chin in their hand, brings up how a coastline can look accurate if you stretch one thing and compress another. The way a map can be right about a river mouth and wrong about why the river chose that mouth. The admirable thing about the fragment is not that it is perfect. It is that it is plausible in so many small places. History is often a debate about whether we prefer spectacular wrongness to quiet partial rightness. Piri splits the difference like a conscientious mediator. His life around the map was not a mystery novel, just a career. He sailed with Kemal Reis, mapped coasts one bay at a time, and wrote a mariner's guide whose tone suggests he liked to give advice and believed advice ought to be useful. He fell out of favor, as sailors sometimes do when the sea and politics have not agreed beforehand on the plan, and he met an end that biographers call unfortunate, because it sounds better than politically terminal. That he drew a controversial map before any of this happened becomes a footnote that accidentally refuses to stay small. You imagine him at a table with a flat stone for burnishing, a brush trimmed to a point, a knife for mistakes, a daylight that moved across the floor without asking permission. Most of us will never draw anything that survives half a millennium. He drew something that survives and then chooses, with some mischief, not to explain itself fully. The map has the pleasant fault of encouraging lists. You could list the sources Piri mentions: Arabic, Portuguese, something that claims to be Columbus's. You could list the parts that look modern: certain capes, certain dented coastlines. You could list the parts that look like Renaissance daydreaming, an island here a little too large, a gulf there that persuaded itself into an extra curve. You could list the scholars who have, with affectionate patience, copied the fragment in pencil, layered modern grids over it, and then backed away in the satisfied way of someone who has measured a cat. You come away with the sense that, in an archive somewhere, a missing cousin of this map still naps under an incorrect label. And that is a good, sleepy thought, not a cliffhanger, just a misplaced folder with a quiet destiny dot in the modern laboratory. The map undergoes rituals that feel like polite magic. Spectrometers whisper to the pigments to ask what minerals they knew in their youth. Microscopes peer at the cracks to guess how often the parchment has flexed. Someone points a light at a wavelength designed to make repairs glow guilty. A conservator with hands that move like slow commas attaches the fragment to a support that will not argue with it. Nothing dramatic happens. That is the triumph. A document remains what it always was, and yet is less likely to become less of itself. You can admire the steadiness of such work historians, learning to say, "We do not know," with confidence. Scientists learning to stop exactly at the point where certainty ends and leave a small, dignified question mark standing guard. There is a quiet political thread hiding in the edges. The 16th century Ottoman court liked maps, but it liked them in the way libraries like rare laces, appreciative, occasionally generous, slightly protective. European courts liked them too, and sometimes liked them a little too much in the direction of monopoly. Secrets became inventory. Inventory became advantage. It is not hard to imagine why a chart that reported earlier discoveries, perhaps indiscreetly, perhaps merely accurately, might not be the one you loan to a rival. Piri's decision to note his sources in the margin could have been a flex, or a footnote, or a way to exculpate himself if anyone objected. "I wrote it down," he seems to say, "so you would not be surprised, because this is boring history for sleep, a small, perfectly unnecessary detail." Gazelle skin parchment has a smell that librarians can identify with an authority bordering on mystical. It is not aggressive. It is a warm, dry library smell with a hint of the field. If the fragment were not under glass, a conservator would keep it in a box with a climate that never loses its temper. Parchment is well behaved if you give it the life it wants, steady humidity, a weight that reminds it of itself, and no sudden sunshine. The map has survived because people kept failing to be careless with it, and because luck behaved like skill. That is as good a summary of preservation as most of us will ever need. When you step back from the case, the map grows quieter, which is an achievement. It could shout. It could try to solve arguments single-handedly. Instead, it waits for questions and answers most of them with a gesture. "Yes, this cape is where you think it is." "No, that island was not so large." "Yes, somebody told me about this river." "No, I cannot tell you whether I copied an ice-free southern land or an unusually confident idea of Patagonia." The calm is part of its charm. Many documents perform. This one converses. It leaves the last word to the contours of its lines and the patience of the person looking. If you take anything practical from the story, let it be the way a fragment can be enough. The left third of a world tells a good proportion of the story. Rivers go on without asking permission, and coastlines fold themselves into the shapes sailors recognize by feel. Somewhere, the missing pieces are still missing. Somewhere, the rest of the Southern Ocean continues to be a rumor with footnotes. The map is content to stand in for what we cannot find, the way a corner of a quill can stand in for its whole pattern, if you know how to look at corners. Should you remain awake long enough to crave a final curiosity, consider this. The parrot on the map is drawn with a competence that suggests the artist had seen parrots at least once. It wears the faintly smug expression parrots wear when they are being accurate about human attention spans. It perches on a caption that repeats someone else's caption, which is the essence of cartography at this scale. The bird does not make the map truer. It makes it more honest. A world full of sailors and translators and pilots and prisoners and copyists could only ever be mapped by a chorus. And Piri Reis, in his discreet handwriting, tells us so that we drift them. The museum lights stay at their patient level. The glass never fogs. The map keeps its secrets the way good furniture keeps its polish. On your way out, you could remember that most human knowledge looks like this: fragments that apologize for being fragments, annotated by hands that had a ship to catch. You could also remember that the Atlantic still has the same shoreline it had when Piri pressed his brush to parchment, minus this or that sandbar with ideas above its station. The coastlines have not changed their mind about being coastlines. The parrot, if it has descendants, still feels very certain about fruit. If, by some gentle miracle, you're still conscious, allow your thoughts to turn like a compass card seeking a magnet, each rotation slower than the last. The admiral's nephew, now a long quiet admiral, keeps his map under glass so no one has to argue too loudly. The scholars check it again next year, just to be sure it is still where they left it, the way you check a sleeping cat. The Atlantic breathes, the parchment rests, and every coastline waits for morning in the way ink waits for light already there, already decided, happy to be looked at, and even happier when the looking is slow. You might not expect a 16th century map to look a little embarrassed, as if it were caught knowing something it shouldn't, but the Piri Reis chart has that mood about it. It begins very politely in the margins. A narrow script, Ottoman Turkish in a sober hand, whispers that 20-odd sea charts were compared, that Columbus's lost map was among them, that the world is a conversation conducted in ink and sea salt. On gazelle skin parchment, which sounds glamorous but feels basically like a very committed bookmark, an admiral named Piri gathers coastlines the way a beachcomber gathers shells, carefully, with notes about who found which shell first, and with occasional small drawings in the margins as if to say, yes, there were parrots, and yes, somebody miscounted them. If you're still awake by the time we reach the part where a court scribe debates which brown was the correct brown for the Atlantic, feel entirely free to subscribe. But there is no rush. The ocean has waited for everyone so far. The seam is Istanbul, 1513, a harbor full of masts like a shelf of porcupine quills. The Ottoman fleet sleeps in the light chop and up the quay, in a room that probably smells faintly of lamp smoke and citrus rind. Piri Reis sits with his Uncle Kamal, who is famous, and with piles of things that are not technically maps, but are treated like maps because sailors have generous imaginations. There are Portuguese rudders, which are essentially nautical recipes. 1 part direction to 2 parts guesswork, stir with a compass and avoid rocks. There are Arabic portalains with wind roses that look like fireworks stitched by a patient nun. There is a memory of Columbus's chart, not the chart itself, because paper leads fragile lives, but a description of it and a rumor, and a sailor's boast heard across the deck when the watch was nearly over and everyone's hands were cold. This is how the world was compiled. One coastline per cup of strong coffee, one capricious promontory per story told twice. The admiral writes in a steady tone as if he is speaking to a future clerk. He says he has checked these lines and compared them. He says he has used information from the Indians, by which he means people who live in places Columbus was certain were India. He says, almost primly, that he does not endorse the mistakes of others. A modern reader may feel an urge to pat the parchment and tell it not to worry. The map is how to say this gently confident about matters that, by the official calendars, should not be known yet. It is like a student who has answered 3 questions correctly and then somehow, through neat handwriting and extreme politeness, has also answered a 4th from next week's exam. We only have the left-hand portion of this world. The rest is gone. A series of small vacancies around the edges where a palace archive suffered one of the 1,000 quiet mishaps that befall paper collections, a damp corner, a winter mouse with cartographic ambitions, a fire that almost nobody remembers because it was the slow kind that turned shelves to a self-gray opinion. What remains looks like the Atlantic exhaling. West Africa leans up like a chin. Iberia is a little hat. South America slopes away as if it has to be somewhere at 4. If maps had posture, this one would be doing its best. In the white spaces, Piri leaves annotations. The coast was seen by so-and-so in a year given in both regnal and Islamic calendars, which is considerate. There are cannibals here, a rumor that travels better than sailors do. There's a wide current that assists the journey home. There are, he notes with the small pleasure of a bureaucrat, parrots in abundance. You can almost hear him put down his pen and flex his fingers. There's so much ocean. There's still more parchment dot down at the bottom edge. Something unseasonable happens. The coastline keeps going. It should not keep going, because cartographers in 1513 are not supposed to be acquainted with a continuous shore across the southern cold. Nevertheless, the pen drifts along a smooth brim, as if the earth were wearing a quiet white hat. Antarctica, or an elegant guess at Patagonia dragged oddly far, lies like a cat sleeping at the foot of the world. It is drawn ice-free, which makes geologists sit up and naps for bedtime listeners sit back, because it is a very long coastline to be mistaken about so confidently. Supporters point out that some bays and shelves match modern seismic profiles with a tidy smugness, like a librarian locating a book that fell behind the stacks. Skeptics say, no please. It is the result of an energetic Renaissance habit. When you have a blank, you draw a pleasing curve and annotate it gently. Both sides are so earnest you want to knit them cardigans and let them rest dot to be fair to the parchment. The southern line is not the only line behaving politely out of schedule. There are river mouths that sit where modern charts also place river mouths, and island dots that look suspiciously like islands we later named with equal confidence. There is a degree of accuracy that would be unremarkable in a 19th century atlas, but feels like finding a wristwatch in a medieval painting. Piri himself is not pretending to be a prophet. He claims his sources were many and contradictory. He is a compiler, an aggregator, a walking footnote with a fleet. If you have ever compared 5 recipes for lentil soup and then produced a 6th that your aunt says tastes exactly like the one your grandmother never wrote down, you understand the method. The map tastes like consensus broth. Sailors left fingerprints of thought on coastlines. Portuguese pilots, with their precise little beads of latitude, hugged shores like shy hedgehogs and recorded every cape twice. Andalusian mariners drew wind as if it were a cousin. Arabic scholars brought in a geometry that would happily measure a planet with a stick and a shadow, and sometimes did. Piri gathered all of this like a market basket of influences. Each note entertains a possibility. Perhaps there is a land farther west. Perhaps the currents bend the ship like sleep bends conversation. Perhaps the world is more sewn together than it appears when you stand on the Bosphorus and count gulls. The map is not a boast. It is a hum, a low song of maybe, with a change as soft as a page turned very carefully. The discussion drifts from parchment to rumor. This is the part of the evening when we place two suppositions side by side and watch them fail to quarrel. Some say the Piri Reis map preserves the echo of older charts, inherited through Arabic libraries from Greek geographers who were themselves recycling. Egyptian surveying inherited from a civilization that liked everything square. Others propose an ancestral maritime culture that kept astonishingly accurate coastline lore, the way some families keep a brownie recipe. A secret in plain sight, passed hand to hand, never quite written, often fondly misremembered. There's also the attractive idea that clever pilots overcharted what they hugged, extending shorelines by analogy into the blank, like doodling the other half of a symmetrical face. Then there is the dignified conspiracy, the kind that wears a cape and speaks rarely. In this version, diligent mapmakers gradually uncovered a fuller world, but their papers were exchanged among courts as if they were both currency and contraband. Portugal did not want Spain to know. Spain did not want Venice to know. Venice hoped the coffee would arrive no matter who knew. Charts were state secrets with seaweed corners. A map like Piri's, compiled from friendly conversations with captured pilots over nice cups of something, would therefore be a kind of jailbreak in ink. It wears no mask. It simply pretends to be a collage. This theory has the cozy logic of a cupboard with a false back. Of course, there was a bigger thing behind the small door. One day, someone will find a memo in a trunk that reads, "Do not show the Admiral the bottom edge, but until then, we hum and turn the page." In less cloaked terms, we also have the dependable human habits, copying errors, which are remarkably faithful, wishful straightening of awkward coasts because bends waste parchment, and the textbook problem of translating someone else's A Short Sail to the South into your own carefully inked degree. It is surprising how often a short sail is either a heroic understatement or an unhelpfully vague boast. Along the margins of Piri's map, distances are sometimes precisely wrong in ways that suggest nobody altered the numbers, only the units. A league, as we know, is a philosophical commitment disguised as a measurement. Even the wind roses have moods. The 32 points throw their little spears of direction as if they could pin the sea to the page. Only the dolphins look relaxed. The map glides into Europe like a rumor with its shoes off. Courtiers and pilots pass it around. Somebody identifies a cape with such confidence that later scholars feel compelled to disagree for 2 centuries. Somebody else counts the parrots again. It appears, disappears, reappears with annotations in a new hand. Eventually, sometime long after Piri writes his paeans to method, the parchment fragment finds quiet in the Topkapi Palace treasury. There it waits with the patience of all paper, which is the patience of old bread. Brave, slightly brittle, good with soup. When the fragment is rediscovered in 1929, archivists make the sound an archivist makes when something oddly important peeks from a stack. Polite surprise plus immediate paperwork. Modern science arrives wearing magnifying goggles and a placid smile. Spectral imaging whispers dates from pigments. The parchment is dated. The inks behave as Ottoman inks behave. The compass roses tell stories about drafting habits. The delightfully named Portolan technique shows up like an old uncle who always brings dessert. Triangles of bearing lines, elegant as cathedral ribs, reveal how pilots turned wind into geometry. Historians hold the map under raking light, which is the kind of light that makes even ordinary papers feel dramatic, and trace weights of brown and red. Some coastlines look astonishingly right. Others have the wobble of a good guess after 3 cups of coffee and no sleep in Cadiz. A few sections, inevitably, seem as if the pen was guided by a traveler who was technically present, but mentally working on a poem. Every so often, someone with a complicated computer overlays Piri's southern coast with a reconstruction of ice-free Antarctic shelves. On some days, according to the computer, they match well enough to inspire a late-night message that begins, "You have to see this." On other days, the same overlay looks like a coincidence wearing a fancy hat. The ocean shifts, ice moves, pencils lie, and the human brain adores patterns like a cat adores warm laundry. Geologists, like patient teachers, suggest that we should not expect a perfect rhyme across 5 centuries of drift, copy, and retelling. Admirers, like patient children, keep saying yes, but listen to the rhyme anyway. The debate is conducted in the gentle tone of people who have both eaten the same conference sandwiches. Even the oddities have their own lullaby quality. A note says the inhabitants of a certain coast are cannibals, a claim now filed under, well, people said many things after long voyages, along with, there are gold-bearing ants. A small animal is drawn where no small animal has business. A river mouth appears a little too tidily, like a guest who arrives precisely on time with an unrequested cake. These details pull at the sleeve of the imagination and then let go. They do not prove. They do not disprove. They simply keep us awake a little longer, which is sometimes all a map intends. Piri Reis himself steps in and out of the margins. He serves the Sultan, sails, fights, writes a famous book of sea lore called the Kitab-i-Bari, receives both praise and, later, a fate typical of high officials who know too much about supply chains. In his notes, he is crisp, professional, and almost endearingly tidy about attribution. Where a modern map would say compiled, Piri lists people, places, years, and occasionally parental relationships. He would have been wonderful on a group project. He does not claim genius. He claims diligence, which, in cartography, may be the same thing wearing choir shoes. When you follow the parchment right to its torn edge, where the missing right-hand half would have shown Europe's busy face and perhaps some of Africa smiling at the Mediterranean, you can feel the odd ache of history's partial survival. We do not know what the absent section contained. One would like to imagine 2 important pieces of information, something beautifully mundane, like a careful tally of ships seen on a Thursday, and something to feed the rumor mill for 500 more years, like a little note that reads, "The southern land continues, free of ice, a useful place to beach a galley." Instead, we have a margin that stops as if a librarian gently lifted a roller dot. It is a pleasant exercise to imagine the map's working room, a low table, a reed pen, maybe a bowl of water with some pigment clouds floating in it like tiny tragic storms. A compass with it, must be said, very sharp points that would not be allowed through modern airport security. Rolls of other charts to be consulted and clipped from, literally, because making a composite often involved cutting and gluing, which means geography was occasionally held together by paste. The past, from a stationary perspective, is basically kindergarten with honorifics. If you listen closely, you can hear the soft, satisfied sound of a straight edge sliding across skin. There is also the practical reality that all maps are compromises. The Earth is a regrettably round object that insists on being laid flat, much like a sleeping cat insists on becoming a rectangle. Piri's projection choices flatten some truths and preserve others. He keeps the coastlines crisp where ships care about them and lets the interiors lounge in decorative ignorance. A river mouth is important. A hypothetical mountain range can go play outside. This is cartographic mercy. No sailor ever grounded a hull on a mountain range in the middle of a continent. Questions of proportionality, therefore, are addressed with nautical ethics. Is this lane likely to keep you off a sandbar at 2 in the morning? If yes, draw it darker dot as the evening lengthens. We drift to the legacy portion, which sounds heavy but is mostly paperwork conducted with love. Scholars cross-reference Piri's notes with Portuguese and Spanish pilot books from roughly the same decades and discover the familiar pattern of human copying, some elegant improvements, some stubborn errors, and a reassuring number of places where everyone seems to have agreed because the wind insisted. Museums scan the parchment and wavelengths nobody in 1513 would have believed were polite to shine on a document. The scans reveal underdrawing, little changes of mind, an extra dot scraped away by the careful edge of a knife. The map is not a monolith. It is a quilt you can see through. There are also the small domestic triumphs. The coastline thought to be exaggerated turns out to be exaggerated in exactly the manner you exaggerate a coastline when you have sailed along it for 3 weeks and would like other people to notice. A cape is in the right place for the wrong reason, but right enough that you smile. A notation about current lines up with modern oceanography, as if the sea has not changed its habits, simply to spite historians. Here and there, the guesswork is so calm that it feels factual. Elsewhere, the facts are so confident that they feel guessed. This is the delightful instability of trying to nail water to paper. And then we return, as maps do, to the question that is both too large and too comfortable. What if it is all true? What if Piri Reis really copied fragments of a tradition that knew the shape of the southern land before the cold laid its quilt over it, or at least guessed its sweep with uncanny grace? What if there were, tucked into some harbor library now melted into dust, an atlas of a world apprehended by coasting and careful talk, handed down by people who did not always name themselves loudly in the margins? Or, more likely and more human, what if 100 small competences, an armful of pilot gossip, and a lively sense of visual averaging combine to make a coastline that just happens to look like tomorrow? The map does not answer. It is a very polite object. It provides a set of lines in brown and red, and leaves the rest to your bedside speculation. Its southern coast is either an elegant flourish or a memory. Its island clusters are either reports or decorations. Its parrots are definitely parrots. Like all old papers, it is oddly soothing to look at for too long. The wind roses radiate like little suns. The legends, when translated, are sensible and occasionally gossipy. The whole thing feels both overconfident and modest, like a very well-educated person who will still ask for directions. If you're still awake, you can picture the final scene. A clerk in the Topkapi treasury lays the fragment on felt. Under raking light, the brown inks lift a little, and the curves of coast grow shy. Someone traces them in the air without touching. This is the part where modern measurements get mentioned: portable X-ray fluorescence, multispectral imaging, digital rectification, and then put away, because despite their cleverness, they cannot answer whether the brim at the bottom is a ghost of Antarctica or a Renaissance flourish. The clerk breathes. The parchment rests. The admiral's handwriting politely minds its own business. Somewhere very far south, ice and water discuss their ongoing arrangement. We end, if end is the right word for a map that is mostly an ellipsis, at the torn margin where the world simply stops because the page does. You can trace your finger along the last visible cape, feel the small fatigue of a pen that has been steady for many hours, and imagine the missing sheet. Perhaps it showed Europe very proud of itself. Perhaps it was blank and waiting for another evening with lamp smoke and citrus. Perhaps Piri put down his pen because the coffee was finished and the sea would still be there in the morning. The coastline at the bottom keeps wearing its quiet white hat. The parrots continue to be abundant, and the map, with so much left to say, settles back into silence, which is a very good shape for sleep. You might not expect a single sheet of gazelle skin to act like it knows a secret, but the Piri Reis map carries itself exactly that way, polite, smooth, and slightly guilty. as if it has overheard a conversation between continents and would prefer not to be asked for details. It begins very modestly, with handwriting in the margins. The script is Ottoman Turkish, clipped and neat, speaking in the comfortable tone of an admiral who has spent many nights steering by stars and the smell of rope. He says he compared 20 charts. He says some were Portuguese rudders, which are basically navigational cookbooks with strong opinions and approximate measurements. He hints that one source came from Columbus, or from a man who had once folded Columbus's map and remembered where the creases fell. The parchment is a collage, an anthology of coastlines, a scrapbook of guesses improved by habit. If you're still awake by the time, I reach the part where a copyist decides which shade of brown best represents a 1513 Atlantic. Feel free to subscribe, but truly, don't exert yourself. The oceans are patient. They will wait for our paperwork. Dawn in Istanbul, 1513. In the shipyards, masts make a small forest that refuses to grow leaves. The Bosphorus moves like a soft hinge. In a quiet room that likely smells of lamp smoke, salt, and the faint lemon of clean brass, Piri Reis spreads the skin flat with little weights that look like pastries but are probably stones. He is an admiral and a nephew. His uncle Kamal Reis is famous, which is the sort of family detail that always leads to good dinner stories and occasionally to steady employment. Around him sit the tools of cartographic housekeeping: reed pens, sharpened points, a compass with tips so sharp that modern airport security would confiscate it and write a report. There are Portolan charts with wind roses blooming like stitched fireworks. There are pilot books that read like letters from the sea to anyone who will listen. There are murmurs from captured pilots traded as politely as recipes. On the parchment, the lines begin. Iberia tucks its chin. West Africa leans forward like someone trying to hear a quiet joke. Across the ocean, South America lounges, not yet fully introduced to anyone in this room, and thus drawn with that particular confidence we reserve for people we've only met once, but tell others we know well. Piri writes marginal notes in a voice that sounds like a well-dressed librarian. He names sources not because he intends us to grade them, but because sailors respect the origin of a rumor. The currents off the coast are strong, he whispers. The parrots are abundant. The people over there, he points with ink, might be cannibals, though that tends to be what sailors say when supper is late and a storyteller is standing on a coil of rope. He records distances and leagues that sometimes behave like philosophy rather than measurement. He collects river mouths with the tidiness of a person who has spent a lifetime tiding ropes. He overlays one set of sins over another, straightens coasts that other men bent out of fear, bends coasts that other men straighten to save ink. The map is less an announcement than a compromise. Only the western half survives. The right side, the sociable Mediterranean, with all its gossip, the complicated weave of European waters, vanished somewhere between a quiet palace fire and a mouse with archival ambitions. What remains sits today in Topkapi Palace, a fragment like a sentence that stops before the verb. Because of this, the left-hand world feels oddly intimate. The Atlantic is a long exhale. Islands dot it like a thoughtful pause. The margins keep their murmured commentary, a kind of footnoted sea breeze. The whole thing looks as though it knows the answer to a question you can't quite remember asking. And then, at the bottom, the line keeps going. It should have curled away into ignorance, a polite edge where cartographers write unknown with decorative flourishes. Instead, the shore runs smooth and confident under South America, a continuous sweep like the brim of a hat. Some see Antarctica without ice, the ancient coastline peeking out as if the planet briefly let its hair down. Others see a generous Patagonia, stretched to keep the map company, a Renaissance habit of filling blank space with something that looks like it belongs there. On Tuesdays, the curve aligns suspiciously well with seismic profiles of continental shelves, and on Wednesdays, it doesn't. this is not the map's fault. The world moves, sea levels breathe. Copyists make improvements with enthusiasm. People love patterns like cats love warm laundry. The southern brim remains a nap-friendly riddle. Elsewhere, the accuracy is quietly, almost shyly, impressive. River mounts sit where they should. The bulges and bays of Brazil behave. The islands off the African coast hold their positions as if answering roll call. In places, the distances wobble like deck planks in weather, which is how you know the pilots were writing from memory while they're tea cold. In other places, the accuracy feels like a secret handshake between centuries. The Admiral has done what good compilers do. He has averaged human error into something that looks like intention dot to understand the mood drifting around the parchment. Imagine the libraries that fed it. Maprims were strategic pantries. Portugal tucked charts into chests and assigned them guardians who were paid to frown. Spain kept a house of trade that collected pilot logs the way a school collects excuses for being late. Venice traded gossip like nutmeg. The Mamluk and then Ottoman archives curated translations of translations, wisdom pressed then across languages like gold leaf. Every coast was the offspring of 5 rumors and 3 careful soundings. When Piri writes that he has compared his sources, it is less boast than etiquette. The scholarly equivalent of washing your hands before dinner dot. There is, of course, the crisp suit of conspiracy that hangs in the closet of any discussion like this. It proposes that somewhere, in some sea-stained chest, there existed a set of charts more complete than anyone wanted to admit geographies collected by ancient navigators whose maps were inherited into Arabic, then into Mediterranean practice, then into the Admiral's neat Ottoman hand. In this version, Piri's map is not discovery, but disclosure. Monarchs kept secrets not because the seas were greedy, but because monopolies are shy. Pilots were bound by oaths that dissolve wonderfully when captured in battle and treated to good bread. The collage presents itself as collage, but, say the conspiracists, it is also a window into an older atlas the size of a rumor. The theory is appealing in the way tidy cupboards are appealing. You open a little door and a larger room waits behind it. More ordinary explanations jog patiently alongside. Copying errors are loyal. Once adopted, they stay in families for centuries, like a cousin who always sings the wrong verse at celebrations. Scribes adjust latitude marks to flatter their instruments. Coasts straighten because corners hoard ink. A short sail south, said in one language, becomes a statistical event in another. People love to center the world they know. Pilots exaggerate the capes that frighten them and neglect the inlets that fed them well. Piri's map reads like a ledger of these habits. Tidied here, softened there, corrected with the erasing edge of a knife where the Admiral remembered a better bend. The notes drift into a tempo of court whispering. Ships are seized and pilots questioned, which is the polite word for interviewed aboard a comfortable bench. A Portuguese master mariner explains a current with the authority of a man who has fought it twice and been splashed by it 3 times. An Andalusian describes an island by its parrots because birds do not argue about sovereignty. A Genoese clerk carefully converts distances into a unit nobody else in the room will use. All of this ends up under Piri's pen, which never hurries. If you've ever retyped a friend's grandmother's recipe, no quantities, the 3 kinds of sum and 1 instruction that reads until right, you already know the mapmaker's craft dot. We may pause here for the tiniest nap of science. In the 20th century, the fragment comes back into the light and immediately meets machines eager to look at it, politely in ways it has never been looked at before. Under raking light, the inks reveal thickness, some lines laid in a single patient pass, others built like tiny fences. Multispectral imaging teases out, underdrawing, faint ghosts of hesitation where the pen rehearsed a curve. Portable X-ray fluorescence confirms pigments that would have been available to a careful Ottoman scribe. There are underscrapes where a point corrected a dot the Admiral must have disliked. The Portolan geometry triangles of bearings radiating from little suns lines up with what pilots used to tie wind to distance. Taken together, the verdict from patient people in gloves is soothing. The map is exactly what it says it is, an honest composite by a competent human with good stationery. And still the southern curve keeps being interesting without promising to be important. It is like a guest at a quiet dinner who tells a story that everyone leans in to hear. And by dessert, nobody can remember whether the story happened to the teller or to the teller's friend. Did Piri copy a line from a source older than Columbus? Did he extend Patagonia to rest his pen on geometry? Did an island grow into a cape the way anecdotes become family history? When scholars overlay the brim with modern reconstructions of ice-free shelves, sometimes the rhyme is uncanny enough to make maps hum a little. Sometimes the rhyme is merely coincidence making shapes, which coincidence does as a hobby. The map does not insist. It allows wonder to be sleepy. There is a domestic pleasure, too, in the tiny belongings left on the page. A monstrous fish, rendered with the resigned face of a creature that has been misrepresented for centuries, lounges in a marginal sea. A ship, all friendly sails, crosses a space none of us will ever cross in exactly that way again. A label mentions red-skinned people, a phrase that tells you more about the labeler than the labeled. A dotted track suggests a voyage that may have happened precisely once and been told 100 times with adjustments. FO weather and dignity. None of these details proves anything. They function as good bedtime facts, almost true or true in a generous way, and pleasantly useless for solving problems tomorrow morning. Piri Reis himself steps forward and back like a considerate host. He compiled, he sailed. He wrote the Kitab-i-Bari, a pilot book so attentive to harbors that reading it feels like strolling the shoreline with a knowledgeable neighbor. He ended like many officials who knew more than one kind of tide, in a way that was politically inconvenient, but in the margins he remains careful and kind. He cites his informants. He corrects himself without drama. He presents the map not as revelation, but as housekeeping. The coast here, the current there, the parrots several. It is the earnestness that wins you. Many marvels in history arrive wearing trumpets. This one arrives with a ruler. If the missing right-hand portion ever reappears from a trunk in a provincial archive, from the back of a cabinet built to be too large for any hallway, perhaps it will answer some questions with the discretion of a civil servant. Perhaps it will show Europe arranged like a confident dinner table. Perhaps it will not add anything except a nice border and a better drawing of Sicily. Meanwhile, the fragment we have does the work of fragments. It invites, it suggests, it shrugs. You can run a finger along the torn edge, do not. The curator would prefer you didn't, and feel where the world becomes silence. It is a very gentle silence, like the hush in a room where someone is almost asleep. Back in our soft-lit study, with the Admiral's script whispering across 500 years, you can practice the map's favorite activity, which is thoughtful drifting. Drift between explanations. Drift along coasts that fit like familiar shoes and coasts that look like guesswork making itself presentable. Drift over questions about old knowledge hiding in new hands, and newer knowledge hiding in old hands, and the seam where they meet without fuss. The southern brim keeps wearing its elegant curve. The parrots remain as numerous as promised. The wind roses keep pointing in every direction at once, which is either very helpful or beautifully pointless if you're still with me awake in that tranquil way where you could fall asleep if the page would just breathe a little slower. You might think how most maps are less about saying there and more about saying, this will probably do. They are, at heart, comfort objects that help us place teacups on a very large table. The Piri Reis chart is excellent at this. It has the temperament of a careful ant, well organized, fond of notes in the margins, capable of admitting doubt without suffering a crisis. It makes room for the notion that someone, somewhere earlier than expected, might have sketched a line we rediscovered later. It also makes room for the equally sturdy notion that people with pens can be both lucky and neat. There is a final picture worth holding as your eyelids negotiate terms. Imagine the admiral lifting his pen after finishing the last elegant cape he intends to draw that evening. The lamplight gathers in the bowl of a compass. The room smells of vellum and smoke and the ghost of oranges. Outside, masts tap one another in the dark. He sets a small weight on the map to remind the parchment to stay flat overnight. Somewhere far south, a coastline either lies under ice in the dark or does not, and either way, the sea turns over in its sleep. The map waits in the steady breath of the room. The wind roses do not move. The ink dries to the quiet color of old coffee. Someone years later will read the marginal notes and nod to a man they will never meet, and that is enough. A sheet of skin behaves like a doorway. A careful hand becomes a voice. The world leans its cheek on the table for a while and lets itself be traced. When you close your eyes, the southern curve is still there, polite as ever, undecided about whether it ought to be famous. The parrots roost in the trees beyond the beach, bright and repetitive. The currents continue to help homebound ships at an angle described by a man who did not exaggerate currents. The missing half remains purposefully missing, like a lullaby that ends before the last word on purpose. And the map, grateful to have done enough for one night, folds the Atlantic into a single slow line and lets the room grow quiet.